If you have your book, turn to page 212. We will be discussing science and the scientific method. Science, it might seem strange that the scientific method is in an English textbook, but it's here because critical thinking and scientific thinking overlap a lot. They have similar standards, etc., and a whole lot of information that's out there is wrapped up with science. But you need to understand what science really is. Some people misunderstand what it's really about, but science, real science, only uses natural explanations and only addresses physical processes. It cannot address the supernatural, the spiritual, etc. It just doesn't do that. It uses peer review. That's where scientists, real scientists, submit their work to other scientists and they review it. It's checked. And it's self-correcting. The idea there, sometimes people say scientists are always changing their minds, and that's not really fair, but what they do is they correct themselves some. When I was a kid, 50 years ago, I remember a man I knew had bad ulcers. And from what doctors knew, medicine's all about science, it was recommended that he just, drink some milk, that would help his stomach. Well, as they studied more, they found out that milk doesn't really soothe one's stomach. It actually aggravates it. And so doctors no longer tell you to drink milk if you have an ulcer. It also operates according to the scientific method. And in that, scientists are curious people. They see something that's going on. They question what's happening here. And then they have a hypothesis about it. Then they make a prediction of this hypothesis is correct. They'll do some experimental testing. And then notice 6, I wanted to point that, it's the revision of the hypothesis or tentative acceptance. And it's always tentative. It's always tentative because it is, and I'm glad we looked at that first, it's induction that's taking place. We're looking at evidence, pieces of evidence, and making some sort of conclusion about the evidence. And when we use induction, it's never definite. We hope it's cogent. That means highly probable, and that's the best we can do. And scientific theories, you should know the difference here, and scientific facts. The scientific theory is a wide-ranging explanation of events we observe. It is a conclusion that is being made about naturalistic events or happenings, phenomena. That's a scientific theory. Now, to make a scientific theory, we use scientific facts, and it's mentioned here the results of experimental testing could be called scientific facts. It's not just experiments and testing. It's observations sometimes is what it is. We're just looking at something. It's undeniable what's happening. So it's not always the result of experiments per se that we wind up with scientific facts, but a scientific fact is just like any fact. It is what it is. You can't debate it. It is a fact. And you'll notice they gave the example here of germ theory of disease. Well, that's a scientific theory, and you don't want to say the theory is just some dumb hunch. It is not, because scientific theories are always based on scientific facts. A fact isn't better than a theory in this case. A theory is how we understand the facts. If we didn't have scientific theories, we wouldn't make any progress. We really wouldn't understand anything. So I had you looking at this. Hopefully I've explained science, scientific fact, and theory. This is very important. Pseudoscience, this is a problem because we think so highly of science. Walker Percy, a great American writer, said that scientists are the high priest of modern society. And they are. I mean, if we want to know what's true, we ask scientists. We want to know what science says about things. Science, by the way, a scientist speaking about unscientific topics is just as stupid as the next guy. Science, again, does not address issues outside of the natural universe. Again, it can't address the supernatural. Pseudoscience is false science, and the problem with pseudoscience is it's not really science but pretends to be science. And the ideas held by them, sometimes it even involves the supernatural or occult. And practitioners of pseudoscience, people that do supposed research in these areas, tend to be ignoring evidence and avoiding evidence. So they're weak sense critical thinkers. They rationalize. They're rationalizers, and they practice confirmation bias. Now, they have some good examples here. Pseudoscience. This is an example of pseudoscience. When you see shows like Ghost Hunters, I watched one of those once, there's pseudoscience involved. First of all, a ghost is a spiritual thing. It's not a natural thing. But in Ghost Hunters and other shows like that, many times they will go into a place trying to determine if there's paranormal activity, and they will even use instruments and have actual readings. I watched one, and they were walking through this house, and suddenly there was a place where the temperature suddenly dropped, and they had an instrument there measuring the temperature, and they had an instrument that was measuring radioactivity and Geiger counters, and there's a slight bump, and they said, oh, that's possibly means that there's a ghost here. And they're using scientific terminology and data collection methods in a way that isn't proving anything. I mean, if there's a sudden cold place of air inside a room, maybe you need to get a caulking gun or something, seal up something. But it also mentions here that if a belief doesn't claim to be science, it's not pseudoscience. Religious beliefs, spiritual beliefs, they're not pseudoscience. So, a few things you needed to know. I almost posted a link here, but decided not to. You should look up homeopathy. And all you have to do is go to Wikipedia. And homeopathy is something that people still believe in, and it's just silly. It's the notion of taking an inert substance that normally would, a substance that would cause sickness, and you basically dilute it so it's very diluted. Then you give it to somebody, and it's supposed to have healing properties. And if you just hear it, it almost sounds a little bit like inoculations, but it isn't. When you really dig into it, it's just silly. And homeopathy, the article comes right out and says it's pseudoscience. But I've known people who believe homeopathy. I know people who, one woman, she's a nurse, she should know better. She was asking if somebody knew a doctor who was open to homeopathy. And I was thinking, my gosh, if you've got a doctor that thinks homeopathy's got some credence, you don't want that doctor. That's just not a good idea. But science, pseudoscience, is important to have a concept about what that is, because in much of life, what we want is good science. That's how we make scientific decisions. Because of that, people will push things off as being scientific when they're really not. So I just wanted to touch on that. That's all I'm going to say. I hope that you're well. Have fun. Stay out of trouble. Be good.